Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's WEConnect International webinar. My name is Maggie Berry, and I'm the Executive Director for WEConnect International here in Europe, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for today's webinar, which is the art of negotiation, how to get the best result every time. Today's session is being presented by Natalie Reynolds, who is one of WEConnect International self-registered women-owned businesses. And Natalie is a recognised thought leader on effective negotiation and the benefits it can deliver for individuals and for organisations. And she's trained clients all over the world on how to negotiate and influence more effectively, including the likes of JP Morgan, the European Investment Bank, Deloitte, KPMG and MasterCard, just to name a few. Natalie has a passionate interest in the role that gender can play at the negotiation table, and she spent a number of years researching the issue, providing coaching for women to boost confidence and challenging stereotypes. So I'm delighted that she's presenting for us today. Natalie's going to talk probably for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to questions. To keep background noise to women, participants will all be on mute, so please use the chat functionality to ask any urgent questions you have while Natalie is speaking, and I'll be keeping an eye open for them. The session is being recorded, so you will be able to listen back to it again, and I'll be able to share it with everybody who wasn't able to join us today. So thank you very much for joining us, and Natalie, a big thank you to you for presenting for us today. I'm going to pass the presenter rights over to you now so that the session can begin. So Natalie, just pass the presenter rights to you, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here doing this webinar for WEConnect today. The screen that you can see, the slide that currently is there, says, "Is negotiation a man's game?" which is almost an alternative title for today's session. Another alternative title would be "How to Get What You Want." And those are two real things I want you to take away from today. We are going to talk about the impact of gender when we negotiate and how to overcome that. And you're also going to see, hopefully, that what I'm going to be talking to you about isn't just going to be relevant when you are negotiating with suppliers or clients or customers. It will reverberate at every level of your life. And I hope that by the end of this, you are as passionate about negotiation as I am. So let's begin. So a little bit about me and my firm. So as Maggie said, Advantage Spring, we train big corporates all over the world in how to negotiate effectively. And we do that through in-house training programs. We do executive coaching and consulting and advisory work. And those are some of the examples of the people that we work with across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. But it doesn't end there. It's not just all about profit and business, I have to say. We are heavily committed to pro bono work at my firm. So we believe, and you're going to see this as we go through today, that negotiation is not just a business skill. It is a life skill as well. And not everybody has the luxury of corporate training or masterclasses or indeed access to fabulous networks like WeConnect and webinars like this. And for some people, the need to be able to negotiate for what they want can be the difference between whether or not they have a good quality of life. Indeed, in some instances, it's life and death, the ability to be able to negotiate. And on the screen, you can see some of the examples of people we've done pro bono work with. So with the NSPCC, we trained their top team. The Cherie Blair Foundation for Women, we've conducted various webinars and events for them. Human Rights Watch, similar to the NSPCC, we trained their head office here in London. And I'm particularly honoured and delighted that I've been doing a lot of advisory work for UN Women, both here and in New York. And that's about giving negotiation skills to women across the globe who need them to be able to develop their businesses and improve the quality of life for their families. So that's a little bit about me and my firm. Well, you're going to see this as we go through today. I am ridiculously passionate about negotiation and the benefits that it can bring to men and women around the world. So what I hope that you will be able to do as we go through this session is to be able to have some views on it. So please do feel free to tweet me with any of your thoughts about today. So, you know, that's my my Twitter handle up on the screen, @ADVSpringCEO. I would love to get any comments that you might have about what you've learned from me here today. So, what we're going to do in this session is we're going to break it down into 3 parts. So the first part is going to be looking at common negotiation mistakes. And the reason I point out these mistakes is because I want everyone to realize that no matter how experienced you are, nobody is immune from bad habits when it comes to negotiating. And some of these mistakes, you are probably not even aware that they are mistakes. Or indeed, you may not be aware that you are doing them at all. So it's really a bit of a leveler for all of you, but also a bit of a wake-up call if you are making these mistakes. The second part of the session is going to be a how-to. So I'm going to be sharing with you some top tips to make sure that you are able to get the best deal every time you negotiate. And then the final part of the session is going to be looking at 3 common gender stereotypes. So these are stereotypes about all of you, about women as negotiators. And one of the things I should say up front is that even though I talk a lot around the world and deliver keynotes, I talk about whether or not our gender influences our ability to negotiate. My view is that men and women are just as able as each other when it comes to being able to negotiate. However, we would be very foolish if we didn't take on board the fact that men and women experience different stereotypes, expectations, and assumptions which can influence how they are perceived as negotiators and indeed how they perform as negotiators. So the final part of the session is me really exposing some of these common stereotypes about women as negotiators and providing some tips that we can overcome them, hopefully. Okay, so let's begin. So as you can see from the slide on the screen, these are just some of the people that we will negotiate with on a daily, weekly, monthly or annual basis. So if you can see yourself there in the middle, you know that you negotiate with your colleagues. So you might negotiate in relation to who's going to deliver the difficult message to the boss, who's going to stay late to get something finished, who's going to go downstairs and buy the coffee even. You will also negotiate potentially with your boss in relation to salary, promotion, pay rise, job title, etc. But you will also negotiate in your personal life. So you will negotiate with your partner, your husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, whatever that might be. And I know that I start most mornings by turning around to my husband and saying, if you walk the dog, I'll get our son ready for school. And the reason I say that to him, well, normally I say it because it's wet, cold and windy. Here in the UK very often, and I don't really want to walk the dog. But the more important reason I say it to him is because it's a trade. If he can do this for me, then I can do something for him. And the reason I say it is because I don't want him to think I'm going to run around doing everything for him. It's a two-way street. He needs to do something for me too. Now, interestingly, we trade like that, which is a very sensible way to negotiate, by the way. We trade like that a lot in our personal lives. We'll say to our friends, I'll buy this round of drinks if you buy dessert, for example. Or I'll pay the cab driver if you let him drop me off first. The problem is we don't often then carry that through into our professional lives. And later on, I'll tell you why that's such an issue. We also negotiate with our wider family. So around October every year, I start the annual negotiations with my mother-in-law about where we're spending Christmas that year. And that then leads me on very nicely to the most effective of negotiators, children. So those of you with children will know that they are often amazing negotiators, and my son Leo is no exception. He's an amazing negotiator and is incredibly effective at getting what he wants. Now, this isn't because I've taught him, it's because children naturally are effective at negotiating, and there is a simple reason for that. The simple reason is, up until about the age of 8 or 9, children don't care that much about what you might think about them. So when it comes to trying to get what they want, they will employ any behaviours necessary to get the result that they need. So for my 3.5-year-old Leo, the result he wants tends to revolve around sweets and staying up late and watching TV. and he will do whatever it takes to get that result. Now, for my son Leo, that tends to involve him screaming, throwing things on the floor, throwing himself on the floor, and generally being very noisy and attracting a lot of attention. And interestingly, my husband and I tend to concede and give him what he wants, particularly if we're in a public place and there are lots of people watching. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that the next time you go and negotiate with a supplier, you throw yourself on the floor, start screaming and start stamping your feet. But there is something that we can learn, particularly as women, which is that when we are coaching people around the world, one of the big things that comes back is people will hold themselves back at the negotiation table for fear of people not liking them. Their likability impacts the results of the negotiations that they do, as in they don't aim hard enough, they don't push hard enough for the result that they need because of the fear of how they might be perceived. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't care at all about whether people like you, because of course, science tells us that we are more likely to say yes to those people that we like. However, there's a fine balance to be struck, and to me it's the test between being liked and respected. And in a negotiation, my view is, would I rather be liked or respected? Well, if I can't have both and I had to choose, I'd always choose being respected. So what we can learn from children, I think, is that we need to get the balance right, and that sometimes we need to push a little bit harder to get the result that we need, and not allow our fear of not being liked to hold us back from getting what we are entitled to. So then other negotiations that we do, obvious ones, are with contractors, service providers, customers, clients, but the one I'd like you to really reflect on today is the negotiation that we do every day routinely with ourselves. So I'm referring to the little voice in your head. And the little voice in your head tends to talk to us when we least want it to or need it to. And imagine if you were going to negotiate a salary, for example, you might have done all the planning and preparation in the world, you might have all your figures ready, you may have planned where you're going to open, but then when you sit down and you open your mouth, all of a sudden your nerves kick in and the little voice in your head says to you, do you know what, you probably shouldn't ask for that much. They're going to think you're a bit greedy. You should be just glad that you've got a job at all. And when you do open your mouth and you do make the ask, you end up asking for far less than you'd originally planned. Now, we all have a little voice in our head and we all engage with it constantly. It's just some of us are better at controlling its limiting effects than others. Now, if you are aware that the little voice in your head is an issue for you when you negotiate, I don't have time to talk too much about it today, but I would urge you to go on the Huffington Post website, search for my name and an article called The Inner Negotiation. And in that article, I provide 5 top tips for turning that very negative voice into a positive one. So I hope you can see immediately that we're not just here to talk about negotiating contracts with suppliers. We are talking about negotiation in its broadest sense, which is why I and my team will always use the definition that you can see out there on the screen. Negotiation is 2 or more parties resolving differences to try to reach agreement. The 3 important elements of that definition are as follows. Number 1, in this definition, we don't mention money. We don't mention pounds, euros, dollars, or yen. And the reason we do that, quite simply, is because we don't always negotiate on price or cost or fee. Oftentimes, we will be negotiating on things like risk or deadline or personnel or point of view or perspective. But that doesn't mean they are any less relevant or important to the health and sustainability of your business than the ones that are about money. The second point is this definition does not prescribe what a negotiation should look like. And the reason we do that is because a negotiation could look like you and I having a conversation over a cup of coffee, right through to a multivariable, multi-party, cross-border mediated £2 million contract dispute, and everything in between. And that's not even factoring in some of the international diplomacy and negotiation work we do with the likes of the UN, for example, which is, again, a whole other different level of negotiation. And the third final part about this definition is the word try. And the reason the word try is so important is because the reality is that even with the best will in the world, not all of our negotiations end with a handshake or with a signing on the dotted line. Many will end in disagreement or an inability to reach agreement, or agreeing to disagree, having to walk away because circumstances have changed. But what we want you to recognize is that being able to manage those circumstances is just as important to your ability to negotiate as those when you know that you're going to be able to reach an agreement at the end. So let's begin then with some common negotiation mistakes. And the 3 mistakes that I'm going to talk to you about today are trying to avoid negotiation, thinking it's about winning, and assuming everyone shares your values. So the first one then, trying to avoid negotiation. Well, the reason we flag this up is because a lot of the people that we train in companies all over the world, there's no one here who doesn't really fall into this camp. A lot of people will try and avoid negotiation, and they do this for a number of reasons. They might do this because they find it uncomfortable and embarrassing. Other people avoid it because they find it time-consuming, and other people avoid it because they feel that if they bypass the negotiation, it will strengthen the relationship and the transparency between the parties. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's not a clever strategy, and the reason for that is negotiation is a necessary ritual. It's part of our DNA, and we have been doing it since the dawn of civilization. Avoiding negotiation is not going to help anyone in the long run. So I say, it's in our DNA. I mean, just think about this for a moment. So negotiation really is in the fabric of who we are as creatures. And so you can see that negotiation is what allows friendships to thrive. It's what allows marriages to survive or not. It's what allows societies to coexist. It's what allows businesses to get business done. And it's what allows countries to cooperate or otherwise. Negotiation is an inherent part of what it is to be human. And to pretend it doesn't exist is going to backfire. So there are 3 simple things I want you to recognize. The first one is people value the things they work hard for. The second thing is, if something is too easy, we will start to wonder why. And it's basically this point that, you know the old saying, never look a gift horse in the mouth. Well, the reality is we all do, don't we? If something's handed to us on a plate, if something's too easy, we will start to wonder why that might be the case. And a nice example of that might be, imagine you go to view a property, and you have a budget for buying a property, and that budget is £450,000. Now, imagine you go and see a house that's on the market for £450,000, and you really like the look of the property, you're really excited by it, and you decide there and then, because you don't want to lose this opportunity, you decide to make the owner of the property a direct offer. So you walk downstairs to where he's waiting in the kitchen, and you say, look, Mr. Jones, I really like your house. Before you can say anything, I'd like to make you an offer for this property of £400,000. I imagine Mr. Jones takes a sip of his coffee, puts it down, looks at you and says, thank you very much, we've got a deal. Nice doing business with you. He shakes your hand, you leave the property, and then off you go. Now, once you get home, what might you be thinking? Now, at this point, a lot of you might be thinking, hang on a minute, that was a bit easy, wasn't it? Or you might be thinking, what's wrong with the house? Or I should have offered less. Now, some of you might, though, be thinking, I'm not thinking that. I'm thinking, I've just got the house of my dreams for £50,000 under the asking price. What's not to like? Now, the thing is you might be forgiven for thinking that. You might be delighted with your offer being accepted immediately. But fast forward 12 to 18 hours, and all of a sudden that little voice in your head will start saying to you all the things I mentioned initially. That was a bit easy, wasn't it? Or maybe I could have offered lower. Or maybe I've just been taken advantage of. You might even be wondering to yourself whether or not a verbal contract or a handshake is legally binding. The point is that people value the things they work hard for. If something's too easy, we will start to wonder why. And the third final point is people like to be given the chance to try and get the best deal they can for themselves. And if you deprive them of that, they will start to wonder what they have missed. And actually, If you deprive the other side of the ability to negotiate and explore what might be possible, that's when they'll start to wonder, what have they missed? What more could they have got? What might you be hiding from them? And when people start to think like that, that's when a deal becomes vulnerable. That's when you become vulnerable to the nibble, where they try and take a little bit extra from you right at the end, or you become vulnerable to the deal breaking down in its entirety. So don't avoid negotiation. It's a necessary ritual. Instead, manage your nerves and your emotions, learn how to play the game, and get negotiating. The second mistake is thinking it's about winning. So we will often ask a question to groups when we speak at conferences or when we're training them, and we'll say, how do you want the other party to feel after negotiating with you? And the answer we like to give is satisfied. But it's very interesting, actually, that we'll get all sorts of answers back, like you want them to feel that it was fair, or you want them to feel that they've got a good result, or that they want to do business with you in the future. However, we will sometimes get some people who are very competitive standing up and saying, I want them to feel shafted. And whenever people answer like that, I always have to think to myself, okay, this is going to be a long day, you'll get through it. But the reality is that at the end of the day, the mistake here is people think negotiation is about winning, and it's not outwardly anyway. Now, of course, my firm doesn't specialize in teaching individuals and companies how to lose when they negotiate. Of course, what we do is we teach people how to win and to be more effective. But what we need to recognize is that you shouldn't celebrate your win in front of your counterparty. So we see examples when we observe people negotiating where people will actively celebrate how pleased they are with the deal in front of their counterparty whilst they're still in the room. Now, for some people, they will celebrate with an excessive, fist in the air, pump in the air. Other people will just turn to the rest of their team and make it very clear through their facial expressions that they've got everything they needed and more. Now, what you've got to think to yourself is, of course, it's great to win, but actually, when it comes to negotiating, if you're ever going to have to see your counterparty again, you need to be concerned with how they feel about the deal. Because if they feel that you've maybe taken advantage of them or manipulated them, or they've won at your or you've won at their expense, that's when they will be the customer or client who will never pay their invoices on time, will always be questioning the validity of what you do, challenging the work that you do. They will just be generally difficult. And the reason for this is that people bear grudges. We hang on to information about our interactions with others, and we use it to inform our future interactions. So if you've made them feel annoyed, frustrated, or embarrassed because you've won at their expense, well, that's when that relationship is always then going to be difficult to manage. Now, of course, if you're never going to have to see those people again, it doesn't really matter that much. But I would say 99% of cases, you're probably going to have to see them again at some point. So negotiation is not about winning, not outwardly anyway. Make them feel like they have won. Make them feel satisfied, because that's when a deal will be infinitely more sustainable. And then the final mistake is going to be assuming everyone shares your values. Now, this is one that's always a bit controversial, so let's get straight to it. So on the screen, you can see two speech bubbles. One is labeled the values of society, and one is labeled the behaviors of negotiators. Now, the first speech bubble, the values of society, includes the words caring, considerate, cooperative, dependable, fair, generous, honest, open, rational, reliable, truthful, unselfish, and willing. Now, generally, they are seen as very positive words. They're the kind of words that we are encouraged to be from a very young age. They're the kind of words that we would like our boss to describe us as, and they're the kind of words we would look for in a partner. That's why we refer to them as the values of society. They tend to be fairly shared, universal, positive values. Whereas the second speech bubble, the behaviors of negotiators, arrogant, closed, dishonest, emotional, inconsiderate, indifferent, irrational, mean, rejecting, selfish, unfair, unreasonable, unreliable, untruthful, they're not so positive. And they're not the words that make us feel particularly comfortable. They're not the words that we would want our children to be described as. They're not the words that we would like our boss to describe us as. And ideally, we wouldn't look for those words in a partner. Now, the interesting thing for me and my team is that actually those behaviours tend to make us feel quite uncomfortable. We don't like to exhibit them generally, and we don't like to be on the receiving end of them generally. And yet we know for a fact that when people negotiate, they will often use these words. They will be these words. So let me be clear on a few points. First of all, I'm not saying that to be an amazing negotiator, you have to exhibit all of those very negative behaviours at once. If you came to negotiate with me and you were arrogant, closed, dishonest, emotional, inconsiderate, and everything else all in one go, I would think you were a comedy villain and I would laugh you out of the room. You probably wouldn't even take yourself seriously. So I'm not saying you should exhibit them all at once. I'm also not saying that my firm train people how to be arrogant, mean and selfish, although I do think that would be a very fun workshop to run. What I am saying is this, is that sometimes when we negotiate, even though we might not feel comfortable doing it, we might have to be some of these things. And a nice example of that is the word closed. So sometimes when we negotiate, we can't possibly reveal absolutely everything we know about the situation. Maybe for legal reasons, ethical reasons, data protection reasons, or commercial reasons, we have to hold some information back. And essentially, that is us being closed. Similarly, if they are asking for something that we physically cannot agree to, we are going to have to be rejecting. And as a result, they might consider us to be a little bit unreasonable. Now, what I really want to focus on, though, are two of those words, and those are dishonest and untruthful. And normally at this stage, I'll get questions saying, so are you telling me that in order to be an amazing negotiator, I'm going to have to lie to get the best result? And my response is the same the world over. My response is universal, and my response is no. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that over the years doing this job, I've realized that the truth and lies are not always black and white, unfortunately. That actually there are multiple shades of grey when it comes to the truth, and that one person's lie is another person's something completely different. People will interpret the telling of the truth very, very differently. So one person's withholding information is often another person's lie. One person's bending the truth, i.e. a little white lie, is another person's completely unacceptable behaviour. And some people have the attitude all's fair in love in business and they'll do whatever they like. Other people think that's illegal and unethical and completely inappropriate. So the point is that lying is unfortunately quite subjective in business, I've discovered. The second thing I would say to you is I'm not telling you to lie. Let's be really clear on that. So you may well have set a baseline for yourself that you do not lie in business, and that's great. But what's not great is automatically assuming that everyone shares your values, and particularly that your counterparty shares your values. And here's the rub. You might not lie, but it would be very foolish of you to just assume that your counterparty is doing exactly the same thing. And here's the other thing. You can't always tell whether someone's lying to you, because people will lie and they'll do it very convincingly. And even though we do specialise in teaching people how to read body language and how to listen to the words that people use, to help spot a lie, it's by no way foolproof. The second thing I would say is you also won't know if someone's lying to you because they won't tell you in advance that that's what they're doing. So I wouldn't start a negotiation with any of you by saying, oh, look, by the way, everything I say for the first 10 minutes or so, it's not true. So keep pushing me, I'll get to the truth eventually. You ready? Let's go. Nobody does that. So the message here, the mistake here is assuming that everyone is as ethical or as honest as you are. Not everyone will be, and you're not always going to know for sure. So my advice is that all clever negotiators need to make sure that they listen carefully and they ask probing questions when something doesn't feel quite right. Never take it as read that what they're telling you is 100% truthful. If it feels wrong, it probably is. And the best way to actually pick apart a lie is to ask diagnostic questions, probing questions about what they're telling you. Because if you can ask questions that really get to the nub of the issue, that's when people's lives will start to fall apart. Okay. So what should we be doing? So I'm going to whiz through now some top tips to help you negotiate more effectively going forward. So the first thing I'm going to do is share with you our 5-step methodology. Now this is called the DEALS method, and the DEALS method is what I talk about in my forthcoming book on negotiation, which is coming out next year. And the whole kind of middle section of the book is about this approach. So you guys are getting some advanced sight of this. So the book isn't out till March, but I'm sharing this with you here today. So DEALS is really, it works as a checklist, I suppose, to help you make sure that you've covered all your bases as you prepare for, execute and review all of your negotiations. So DEALS stands for discover, establish, ask, lead and seal. So discover, establish, ask, lead and seal. So the first stage of any negotiation is to discover. And the discovery phase is about looking at the situation that you are about to go and negotiate and going out there and discovering every possible piece of information you can find about that negotiation. So what's the topic you are negotiating? What's the product you are negotiating? What information is out there about it? Who will be negotiating against you or with you? Discover what the market is doing. Discover what their interest in you might be. Discover as much as you can and think broadly in the discovery phase. One of the things that we have seen is that often people don't conduct enough research and don't think broadly enough about all of the factors that might be influencing their negotiation. So discover as much as you can about the marketplace, the product, the people you're negotiating with, about why this matters to them, about deadlines, timeframes. Get out there, do your research. We then advocate dumping all of your discovery into something called an insight locker. And the more you can stuff into your insight locker, the better. Now, your insight locker might be a file on your computer, it might be a notebook on your desk, it might be just all up in your head. But it's the place where you dump everything that you've found that could possibly relate to your negotiation. The next stage is to establish, so the E of DEALS. And this is where you then start to refine the information in your insight locker to establish what the parameters are going to be in your negotiation. So what you need to do is you need to establish what your break point is going to be. Now, your break point is your walk-away point, your bottom line on every single issue in the negotiation. It's really the point at which if you are a buyer, if you go higher than that, or as a seller, if you accept lower, then the deal is not viable. So establish your break point, establish your opening proposal, establish a whole load of extra proposals, establish what your priorities are in this negotiation, establish what their priorities are in the negotiation, establish where the negotiation is going to take place, establish how long you've got to conclude the negotiation, establish who's going to be on your team, if anybody. But you also need to establish who might be on their team, establish what their priorities are, establish what failure might look like to them. See the world through their eyes rather than just through yours. So in this phase, you are establishing really the parameters of what this negotiation is going to be, where you're going to open, where you'd like to finish, what success looks like, what failure looks like, what your priorities are, and make sure you do it for them as well. Next phase in DEALS is to ask, and we need to make sure that we ask in the right way when we negotiate. So this involves making sure that you've got a number of proposals ready before you get anywhere near that negotiation. A lot of the people we train make the mistake of planning an opening position and then having a rough idea of where they want to get to. But actually what you should be doing is planning a whole load of moves between those 2 points. So need to make sure that you have those planned in advance. Another part of asking in the right way is to frame your proposals, if you, then I. Make sure they are trades. When you're negotiating, don't just keep giving and giving and giving and giving. Make sure that your proposal is along the lines of, if you can do this for me, then I can do this for you. Trading is the most powerful way to make sure you preserve your value and you're always getting something in return. You also need to make sure that when you ask, you try and ask first. And this is all about the phenomenon which is anchoring. which shows us that the person who makes the first proposal is statistically way more likely to get an outcome that is preferable to them. And that's because the person who makes the first proposal has set the anchor for that negotiation. And the other side, it's almost impossible then for you not to then start thinking in terms of what they've just asked for. So try and go first if you can. But if you can't, a really simple bit of advice I'm going to give you is, rather than excessively debating why their proposal is wrong, instead recognize that the best way to beat a proposal is to make one of your own. So if you don't get to go first, instead of arguing with them about why their proposal is rubbish, instead say thank you for that. However, we were proposing this, and then make your proposal, because then you've cast out a new anchor. You also need to make sure that when you ask firmly, clearly and concisely. Don't leave any room for doubt when you negotiate, because people will only ever hear what they want to hear. Make sure you are clear, make sure you are firm, make sure your proposals are easy to understand. The next phase is to lead. And this is about you managing your own behaviours in the negotiation. Make sure you take the lead at the negotiation table. You need to think about what your fears are, how your nerves are feeling, your emotions, and find ways before you even get to the negotiation table to cope with that. You also need to make sure that if you're negotiating in a team, that you take the lead, that everyone knows their role, that people aren't talking over each other. You need to also make sure that you're not just constantly waiting for them to tell you what the negotiation is going to look like. You need to be assertive and confident and calm, because if you're not in control, they will be. So it's not about being bossy. It's not about kind of pointing your finger and telling them they've got to listen to you at all costs. It's about making sure that your team and you are prepared and in control and feeling calm so that you can take the lead in your own way. And then finally, the final part of deals is to seal it. And the reason we say this is because a lot of people will agree a deal and they'll agree on a high. They're really excited and optimistic about what the outcome is going to be, about working with the other side in the future. But at that point, we often don't want to think about what if it goes wrong, what if the performance slips. So our advice on seal is to make sure that whilst you're on that high, have the confidence to say to the other side, you know what, guys, I'm really excited about working with you on this, but we're going to make sure that in the agreement we've factored in some clauses just in case things do go wrong. Because we want to protect each side and make sure that we can maintain a relationship. And that's about making sure that your agreements include clauses on mediation or what poor performance looks like or how you're going to manage any issues that might arise. Don't wait until things go wrong to try and deal with the things going wrong. Preempt, plan for it, and it makes it a lot easier when you're having to deal with the issues when they arise. The other thing you need to be aware, of course, is that not all negotiations are the same. And the diagram you can see on the screen is our little diagram that we use with clients to help them to see that there are different negotiation styles out there. On the screen, we've got haggling, hard bargaining, trading, and working together. And they represent value claim or value create negotiations. Now, value claim tends to be more competitive in nature. They tend to be transactional. It's about one side getting a better deal than the other. And they can be quite tough and direct at times. Value create are more collaborative in nature, and they're often about the fact that it's not always a one-off. There may be multiple interactions between you and and your counterparty. You may need to work together over a longer period of time. The reason I'm flagging this up is some people will go into every negotiation treating it exactly the same. And actually what we will do is advise people that, you need to understand the negotiation that you are in. Now, I don't have time today, but what I'm going to do is share with Maggie a little plotter that we've developed to help people understand what type of negotiation they are in, and that can be shared with all of you after this session today. But it is essential that you've taken the time to reflect on and understand the negotiation that you are in so that you can then plan and behave accordingly. We then come back to if you, then I, the most powerful phrase in negotiation. I mentioned this earlier on. It's a reminder to you to make sure that if you can, to phrase all of your proposals like this. The danger of not doing this is often we will then obsess about the one or two things that we really want to achieve, and we then end up giving away a load of freebies to try and get those things. So it might be that you want a target hourly rate for your services. So you end up giving away free training and discounted payment terms and a higher level of partner working on the project. And you give and give and give all those freebies. And in the end, you get your target hourly rate. But the value of all the freebies you've given away means that actually the deal you've suddenly got isn't so great after all. So we advocate using the language, if you, then I, because it really is the most powerful phrase in negotiation. We also need to think about moving beyond the obvious to offer solutions. And this is about recognizing that when you negotiate, you need to have understood every possible thing that could be traded in that negotiation. What we tend to do is, as I've just said, is we focus on the things that we know matter a lot to us. And then we approach the whole negotiation prioritizing those things. The reality is that we will only ever know the total available value in a negotiation if we've mapped out all of the issues in advance. And some of those issues might not be important to us. The danger is that we don't think about whether they might be important to the other side. Because again, we will often assume that we know what the other side's priorities are. But actually, in the deals approach, you should be using the discover and establish phases to think just as much about what might matter to your counterparty. Quite simply, the reason you do that is so you can trade with them. Because you can't use if you, then I trading unless you've understood both your priorities and theirs. Because again, if you, then I only works if you offer them an incentive, i.e. you offer them something that they want. And the only way you'll be able to understand what all of those issues might be is to map it out like I'm showing you on the screen. If you don't do that, I can guarantee you will be missing out on some of the available value in that negotiation. You should also remember that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. The danger is that when we negotiate, we tend to take two issues, we trade them off against each other and then take them off the table as agreed. We then take the next two issues, we trade against them for a while, then we take them off the table as agreed. So guess what then happens? At the end, we're left with the two difficult issues that we were never going to reach agreement on, and we end up getting really combative and fighting with each other. So instead, you should adopt the mantra that's used in international diplomacy, which is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. You might agree something in principle and take it off the table, but both sides should agree in advance that they will reserve the right to bring things back on the table if they're struggling to reach agreement on any final points. I then want you to think that no is just the starting point. And this reflects the fact that as human beings, we don't like rejection. We don't like to hear or say no to people. And I'm going to focus on us hearing no. And the reason is that often when people say no to us in a negotiation, we will crumble and we see it as the end. And we shouldn't. Instead, we should merely see it as an invitation to explore what could be possible. We get people to retrain their brains to see that no is simply the starting point. It's merely a springboard to exploring what could be possible. So they've said no to you. Okay, don't take that as an absolute. Instead, take that as a chance to say, what could I do to change your mind? How about this then instead? Have you considered this? No is simply your invitation to look at what else could work. And remember, see the world through their eyes. Understand their priorities. If you do that, you can then start to see how you might be able to make them feel satisfied, and in turn, they're then far more likely to help you feel satisfied too. I've also put, don't underestimate the need to save face. This links back to my first mistake about making people feel satisfied. If you negotiate with someone so hard that they then have nothing to go back to their boss or their colleagues with to say, look at what I achieved. Well, you know what, then they're going to be far less likely to help you achieve what you want to achieve. So give them some quick wins if you can. Again, it's a strategic and sensible move to make sure that you win in the longer term. I'm going to whiz through these very, very quickly. I'm conscious of the time. I did provide in advance, and it was on the invitation, an article I'd written for the Guardian newspaper last year on common stereotypes about women. So I'm going to very quickly whiz through these three, and then I'll take questions. So before we do this, I just wanted to share with you some imagery. So on January the 1st every year, I go on Google Images and I type in female negotiator. And this year on January the 1st, these were two indicative images of the kind of ones that came up near the top. So you either have, I'm terrified, I don't know what I'm doing, please help me, or you have, I'm a total bitch. It seems to be one or the other. Now, I flagged those up mainly because they're entertaining, but I do wonder if that just shows the negativity that is often attached to our ability to negotiate as women. So the three stereotypes I've got about women as negotiators are: we tend not to negotiate and we don't aim high enough when we do. We are more effective at negotiating for others, and women are viewed more negatively if they ask. So the first one reflects the fact that women are far less likely than males to negotiate, and study after study after study shows this. And up on the screen, I've given just some examples of the kind of studies that show that women seem to be less likely to make the ask in the first place. The Carnegie Mellon Starting Salary Study is probably a good summary to give you, which is that they discovered when working with college students in the US that upon being offered a starting salary in their first job, only 7% of women would negotiate the offer that was made to them, compared to 57% of men. Now, 15 years ago, when the book Women Don't Ask by Linda Babcock came out, that was equating to a $4,000 average baseline difference between male and female starting salaries. The refresh of that study has shown that that has now moved to around $18,000 difference, and I'm sure you're familiar with the study that shows us that over a lifetime that kind of baseline discrepancy can total up to around $1 million difference between male and female complete earnings over a 30-year career. That's when you factor in then bonuses, benefits, pensions, etc. There's also a sporting example where at the US Open Tennis Championships, female players were 80% less likely to dispute a close line call than male players. Now, the Women Don't Ask book is a really good book to have a look at some of these gender stereotypes. It's probably the seminal text on gender and negotiation. That is until March the 3rd when my book comes out. But until then, of course, read Women Don't Ask. It's a very, very good book. Look, I mean, what we see is that in ambiguous negotiation scenarios where it's not always clear whether you can negotiate, women are far less likely to negotiate than men. And when we do, we don't aim high enough. And this is the other point, that in negotiation, we see time and again that the more you ask for, the more you get. If you're not ambitious with what you ask for, you end up inevitably finishing far lower than you might have been able to do so. Now, of course, we open ambitiously so that we can explore just what the other side might be willing to give us. But we also open ambitiously so they'll feel more satisfied when we then move from our opening position. So again, it comes back to the psychology of how we negotiate. Now, men seem to have no problem with this. Men seem quite comfortable with opening ambitiously and with negotiating compared to us. So my advice is that what we should be doing is A, negotiating, making the ask, and secondly, being ambitious when we do ask. So I always say if you were going to ask for a 10% increase in your salary, ask for a 14% increase. If you were going to ask for a 3-week deadline, ask for a 3.5-week deadline. It's your opportunity to explore just what they might have been willing to give you. The only danger is that you make sure you don't tip the line from opening ambitiously into opening ridiculously and hitting the piss-off point. So that's the point at which you've opened so ambitiously that the other side is going to tell you to do just that. So you need to use your common sense and your understanding of your market to open at a level that is ambitious but credible. Second stereotype then, women are more effective at negotiating for others. A number of you are probably familiar with this. It's probably one of the most well understood stereotypes, and actually the one that I believe actually has a lot of truth in it. We coach a lot of senior women around the world and men, and what we see is that women will fight very hard on behalf of their team members, their family, their friends. They'll negotiate tough and hard, and they'll be direct when they have to be for others. But when it comes to negotiating for something for us, personally, we never push as hard. And again, salary is often a great example of this. That, if we were negotiating for our team members' salaries, we'd do it really well. If we were negotiating for ourselves, we're almost apologetic about it. Similarly, if you were negotiating a contract with a supplier on behalf of a firm you represented, you'd push really hard. But if you were then negotiating for something directly for you, you'd maybe feel a bit more uncomfortable. Now, the woman on the screen is Professor Margaret Neal. She is a real leading light in decision-making, analysis, and negotiation thinking. She's done various bits of research that back this up, that show that, female executives, when they're negotiating for bonuses for their teams, routinely secure higher bonus levels than men do when they're negotiating for their teams. Now, if this is true, there are two bits of advice I want to give you. The first one comes from Professor Neal, and I call it her husband horses chickens advice, which is that if it's true that we are better at negotiating for others, then we should use it to our advantage whenever we do go negotiate for ourselves. So go into the negotiation reminding yourself of all the people who are relying on you to get a good result. So it might be that at home you've got a husband, 3 sons, 2 daughters, 5 horses, 6 chickens, a cat and a mortgage to pay. And remind yourself of that before you open your mouth to negotiate for yourself. However, Dr. Lois Frankel, who wrote the book Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office, tweeted to me something quite different. Her view is we shouldn't peg our own value and our own worth on everyone around us. Instead, we should recognise that we are worth it and put the same effort into representing ourselves as we do everybody else. Now, whichever one of those pieces of advice works for you, use it. But the point is we do see lots of evidence that women feel more comfortable negotiating for those around us. So however you choose to use that, find a way that works for you. And the final stereotype about women as negotiators is that women are viewed more negatively if they do negotiate, if they do make the ask. Now, unfortunately, there is a lot of research that indicates that women are penalised when they negotiate comparative to how men are penalised. So there's been plenty of studies that will show us that when women make an ask for something and men make an ask for the same thing, the women are perceived to be pushy and arrogant and greedy, whereas the men are perceived to be confident and just asking for what they're entitled to. A lot of this comes back to this notion of unfeminine behaviours, and a lot of people will look at women who are confidently asking for something and might make that assumption that she's not being particularly ladylike. Now, unfortunately, the research tells us that it's not just men that make this assumption about women, women do too. And again, there's multiple pieces of research that show us that actually women penalise assertive women as much as men do. The test I always use is, when I'm in business, do I want to be liked or respected? And for me, the answer is always respected. And if me negotiating impacts on my likability, I always think to myself, well, the impact of a lack of likability must be very, very severe for it to make me stop negotiating, or for it to make me not negotiate in the first place. So what I would say is, if someone not liking you is going to result in you being fired or not getting a contract, then maybe you might need to think about negotiating in a slightly different way. But you should never not negotiate. It's always just about amending and adapting how you make the ask. And that's why I say effective planning can help manage this. So when you negotiate, have your business case ready, plan questions in advance, have alternative proposals ready, make sure that you are confident sounding, that you have reasons for why you are asking for what you're asking for. What we've seen from our studies is that people will often say that women appear greedy when they negotiate, because often then when they're pushed on why they're asking for what they're asking for, they don't have a reason for it. So actually having all your reasoning and your business case ready and feeling confident about asking their questions, so answering their questions, is a great way to help manage this. Similarly, your likability can also be preserved by being polite, being courteous, being friendly. You can still be all of those things. It's a hell of a lot easier to be those things if you've already got your proposals planned in advance and you feel confident about how you're going to manage that negotiation. Look, there's always going to be an aggressive, assertive dilemma. We know that from various studies that assertive men are seen as assertive and assertive women are seen as aggressive. You need to think about how you can manage that, and often the best way is to be prepared. And we also need to think about how we challenge the perceptions held by both men and women about women who do negotiate. So my tip is just ask, don't stop negotiating, but do it in the right way and make a commitment to yourself as of today, as of this lunchtime, to not only challenge the men that you work with and get them to change their views about women who are assertive and who do make the ask, but also challenge the women around you. Have a think about your own perceptions of assertive women, and let's try and change things in the long run. But we should never stop negotiating in the interim. The final biggest mistake then is underestimating the impact of people. Negotiation is as much about people and how well we understand each other, all of the things it says on the screen, as much as it is about the facts and the numbers and the statistics and the trends. It's about how we interact, behave, react, view each other, test each other, and perceive each other. So my little mantra to you then is there are 3 simple rules in life. If you do not go after what you want, you'll never have it. If you do not ask, the answer will always be no. And if you do not step forward, you will always be in the same place. Before I open up to questions, I wanted to extend an invitation to anyone listening who is in London next week on the 11th of November to attend an event I'm running with the Guardian newspaper and the United Nations Women's Programme. And it's looking at negotiating the gender pay gap. If you would like to come along to that event, please do email me. My details are on the slide that is on the screen. It'd be great now to take questions.
Natalie, wow, thank you so much. You've covered an awful lot of ground in quite a short amount of time, and I've been busy scribbling down all sorts of different tips and techniques and ideas. And I love what you were saying about, you know, everybody's got bad habits about negotiation. No one is immune from them, and also the piece around likability, which I think is key for so many people. That was really interesting as well. But I had read one of your articles about the little voice in your head, and I know that's something that probably impacts everybody at some point. So thank you so much for sharing all of that different advice, and I will send around again the articles that Natalie had mentioned to read beforehand, as well as the couple. Natalie, I'll get the links from you, the ones that you've mentioned during today's webinar. But using the chat functionality, has anybody got any questions that you'd like to ask Natalie just now? I'm conscious that we're just about to tip over the hour, but if you can stay, you're very welcome to stay for a few more minutes, and we can try and answer any questions if anybody's got them. So does anybody have anything else that they'd like to cover off with Natalie just now?
Maggie, would it be useful for me to address a couple of the questions that were sent in advance that I'm conscious we didn't address in the presentation?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, please do. Okay.
So one of the questions that someone submitted was, how does Natalie cover local cultural influences in training for negotiation? Well, it's interesting actually, and in my book I talk about, there's a whole chapter on cultural differences at the negotiation table. And whenever we train all over the world, and one of the things that of course we have to think about is that different countries have different practices, different approaches to things, different religions will impact things differently. My advice is always that if you are negotiating across boundaries, you should always take the time to understand what cultural differences might exist. A really good starting point is to read the book by Richard D. Lewis, When Cultures Collide, which is a fantastic book around cultural differences in business. And it goes through almost country by country what you might want to consider. And certainly you should take the time to speak to other people in your business, speak to other people in your office, etc., to understand their experiences of negotiating in different cultures. So it goes back to the discover phase of deals. You need to go out there and understand how different cultures will impact. But my warning is always this, is that it's always very dangerous though to stereotype and make assumptions. So of course, go out there and discover what it might be that us Brits, for example, what we might typically do when we negotiate. But I know for a fact, Maggie, I'm sure that I negotiate quite differently to you. I'm sure we're quite different as people in many ways. We'll have our similarities, but we'll also be different. So the point comes down to my final mistake, which is we underestimate the impact of individuals. And of course, you should go and understand cultural differences, but don't automatically assume that everyone you negotiate with from that culture will behave in exactly the same way. So by all means, go and understand the differences, but make sure you're always prepared for the differences in individuals.
Brilliant. Thanks, Natalie.
Just to reiterate, the book is called Richard D. Lewis, When Cultures Collide, to someone who's just sent me that question. Have I got time, Maggie, to answer another one?
Yes, please do. We'll run over for a couple of minutes, and if people need to drop out, then they will, but they can always listen back to these final few minutes on the recording.
Okay. So someone sent a question, which is how to ask for a discount without actually asking for a discount, and at the same time not offending them on the value of their services or products. Is telling them what my budget is an option? So I think the question essentially is there, how do you ask someone for a discount on their services without offending them? Well, the first thing I would say is, of course, that in business, people ask for discounts. And, you know, we're no exception. People will ask for discounts on our workshops all the time. The trick is to use the advice I gave you earlier on, if you, then I. If you are going to concede something in a negotiation, you need to make sure that you're then getting something in return. So the point is if you're going to ask someone to discount something for you, well, that's just them giving and giving. And what are they getting back from you? So what you should always try and do is to request the discount in such a way that you make it clear to them what the benefit of that discount is going to be. So it might be, if you can give us a discount of 8%, then we could commit to making a volume booking this time round. Or if you give us a discount of 10%, then we could commit to writing you a testimonial. So the way you ask for concessions is to make it attractive for them to give you the concession. Telling someone your budget in advance is an interesting one. I often avoid doing that if possible. And the reason for that is if you go in and say, look, my maximum budget is £100, well, actually, they may have been willing to do it for £80. It's just they're not going to tell you that in advance often. So actually, what you should probably do is open ambitiously. So tell them a budget, but don't go straight in and tell them your best price. Because then, again, you've cancelled out your ability to move and make them feel satisfied. You've cancelled out your wriggle room. So do tell them a budget, but make sure it's a budget that gives yourself room to move up to your maximum budget. And if we've got time for one more,
yes.
I'll do one more then. Right, what is the most important thing you do when you are preparing for a meeting you know will include some tough negotiations? And I'm going to answer this quite simply. Preparation. Preparation is 90% of negotiation. I would urge that when people are following our deals approach, the 5-step approach I mentioned earlier, it's absolutely essential that you invest a lot of time in the D and the E, in the discovery and the established phases, because that's where you then protect yourself. The way you plan for difficult negotiations is to make sure you've got plenty of proposals in advance, that you've controlled your emotions, that you know who's going to be involved, that you've thought about what they might say, that you think about what your responses might be, you've discovered all the issues. You know, it's about not winging it, basically. If you know there's a tough negotiation on the horizon, don't wing it, protect yourself, and the way you do that is through effective planning. Maggie, it strikes me it might be useful for me to send through an explanation of deals. So we'll send you through a one-pager of the deals methodology, the Inner Voice article, and anything else I mentioned as well.
That would be brilliant. Natalie, thank you so much. Lots to think about, and some of the comments on the chat have been about how very insightful and lots for people to think about. So thank you so much for sharing some of your expertise with us today. I know this is it's hard to kind of squeeze so much into just 1 hour, so thank you very much. And I know if anybody wants to find out more or you want to contact Natalie, her contact details are on the slides. And I know that she's very happy to have further conversations with people, and if you need any further support around more advanced negotiation training. So I will just say, Natalie, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's joined the call as well. I'll be following up with a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording in case you'd like to listen back. But I'm gonna close today and just say thank you very much, Natalie. That was great. So thanks very much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you, Maggie.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone.